Excellence in Research and the Award for Excellence in Media Relations. Dr. Vaillancourt is highly committed to our broader community, and again, just giving a snapshot of some of her many key activities. She is currently serving on the COVID-19 task force for the Royal Society of Canada, and critically is chairing the Children and Schools Chair. She is chairing the Children and Schools Task Force for the Royal Society of Canada. She's the Associate Editor for the Aggressive Behavior Journal and the International Journal of Bullying Prevention. She's also on the executive team for the PrevNet networks of Centers of Excellence. Today, Dr. Vaillancourt will speak to us about the current state of children's mental health in Canada with a focus on bullying and how it affects mental health outcomes for children. Just before she begins, I'd like to remind everybody that we are recording this webinar, and I'll ask you to hold your questions to the very end, and we'll be posting some information in the chat function that can let you know how to ask questions. So together, please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt as our Owerko Family Distinguished Lecturer for 2020. And I'll turn it over to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Dr. Graham. That was a lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be with everybody. Although I can't see all of you, I won't know if my jokes are going to work, but I'm hoping they will. And, just thrilled to be participating in this distinguished lecture series. I've been following the work of your group for a long time, very aware of it, and I congratulate you all for what you've been doing. So I'm just going to start with a picture of the cats that are bound to bother us today. So I think it's a given that during a Zoom meeting, you either get crashed by a kid or by a pet. So just forewarning, it's coming on to dinner time for them. So there's a good chance that we're going to get a kitty somewhere in the screen. So the learning objectives for today are as follows. First, I'm going to just provide an overview of children's mental health. So what's the current state of knowledge? And it's going to point in a really poor direction. I'm going to talk about how we could reduce the burden associated with children having poor mental health. And in particular, I'm going to talk about peer relationships and how they relate to mental health. I'm going to go through a historical account of the need to belong and talk about how the need to belong is a fundamental human motivator. And then I'm going to conclude with some best practice recommendations. And in particular, I'm going to focus on social emotional learning. So this lecture was really born from an op-ed that I recently wrote with my colleagues Shelley Emo, Deb Pepler, and Peter Zotmari. And it was in response to the 2020 UNICEF report that just came out. And in the UNICEF report, which compares economically advanced countries, so the richest countries in the world, on child outcomes, Canada placed miserably. We were ranked 31 out of 38 on mental well-being. Now, I know that there's a lot of practicing clinicians on this Zoom, and this is not going to surprise you. But for those of you who aren't necessarily in the field directly, this is a really scathing report card. And so we took the government to task and said, we can't do this. If we love children like we say we do, we need to improve this area of health. So now we'll just turn our attention to mental health. I'll just give you an overview just so we're all on the same page and understand where we stand, and then move forward like I mentioned. So when we think about children's mental health, we think about it existing along a continuum, from well-being to emotional problems and concerns and to mental illness. And what differentiates children along this continuum is the presence of disability and or distress. So when that is present, then oftentimes diagnostic criteria is met for a mental disorder. We have a huge problem in Canada when it comes to mental health problems. So about 1 in 5 kids, so children and youth in Canada, have a serious mental health issue. And the latest report card from 2017 pointed to the fact that 22% of children and youth report experiencing 2 or more psychological symptoms per week. Now, how does this compare to the world? So the world prevalence rate for mental health problems, mental disorders in children is 13.4. So we're a little bit above, right? But we compare to economically advanced countries. So again, about 1 in 5, and 1 in 5 in Canada. Adolescent mental health issues are a growing concern. So if you use the UNICEF report cards, which have really stringent reporting obligations, so the way they measure it is very strict. If you look at how the trends are going, you see that things are not improving. So in this slide, and if we just look at the Canada bar, they are comparing the 26 data to the 2010 data to the 2017 data, and there's no improvement. In fact, kids are doing worse. Adolescents are doing worse in Canada. The recent UNICEF report card also highlighted that we're not doing well when it comes to youth suicide. So in the world, suicide is the leading cause of death among youth in high-income countries. So 17.6% of all youth deaths are attributed to suicide. This is a particular problem for boys, and it's a particular problem for Indigenous children in Canada. The UNICEF report card highlighted that Canada ranks 7th highest among economically advanced countries when it comes to youth suicide. There is enormous continuity when it comes to mental health issues. So 50 to 75% of adults with a mental health disorder, their trajectory began before the age of 15. So if we want to remedy mental health issues in adults, we first need to start with mental health issues in children, because mental health problems in childhood begets mental health issues in adolescence, which begets mental health issues in adulthood. And I'm just going to highlight this with a study that I'm working on with my postdoc, Amanda Krigsman. So here are the trajectories of social anxiety. And we're following a large cohort of individuals. We started following these kids when they were in grade 5, so when they were 10, and we're still following them to this day, and they're going to be turning 24. So we modeled the trajectories of their social anxiety symptoms. And if you look at that top trajectory, you see that kids are starting off pretty high, even at 10, and they're staying on that trajectory. They're always high, and in fact, that one's increasing. The kicker, though, is that trajectory actually predicts having social anxiety disorder and generalized anxiety disorder in adulthood using clinical interviews. So it's not incidental. It's not, a phase that kids are going through. There's enormous continuity. They start on a trajectory, they stay on that trajectory, and it predicts having mental health problems in adulthood. In youth, and we know this from world data, mental health problems are the leading cause of health-related burden. And in adults, mental health problems are the leading cause of disability worldwide. Over 14% of deaths are attributed to mental disorders in adulthood. Children don't code switch out of mental disorders. They exist across a variety of contexts, and as I mentioned, they're entrenched. So what I mean by this is that if you have a child who's in school and has mental health difficulties in school, that is a poor environmental match if it only occurs there. When kids have a mental health disorder, it shows itself across contexts, in the home, at school, with their peers, so across all these contexts. And in fact, you can't even diagnose children with a mental health issue, so for example, ADHD, unless it's met across contexts. Comorbidity is the rule rather than the exception in mental health. So 40% of youth with one psychiatric disorder meet diagnostic criteria for another psychiatric disorder. And we know that from this large population-based study I mentioned that we've been conducting since the kids were 10, that the children in our study who have an anxiety disorder always have depression. We rarely see anybody without a comorbid condition. Another issue is that the risk is not equally shared. So unfortunately, you tend to see some clustering. So socioeconomic disadvantage is linked to higher prevalence of mental health issues. So a recent study that just came out a couple months ago showed that kids who come from low-income families in Canada are 25 to 39% higher in terms of mental health difficulties than when compared to their higher income colleagues, peers, sorry. We also know that girls and women, but we're going to focus on children here, are more affected than boys. And there's just two exceptions to that rule, and that would be in terms of externalizing problems like conduct problems and ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. The developmental trajectory of mental health difficulties is quite well established. In early childhood, we tend to see more issues with anxiety. In middle childhood, we tend to see behavioral problems manifesting around age 11. And in late childhood to early adolescence, that's when we really see mood disorders come on. And the earlier the onset of the disorder, the poorer the prognosis in terms of future mental health issues. Now, one of the reasons why kids are particularly vulnerable is because they're so influenced by their environment, and they're more influenced by their environment than adults. And this is because they have a lack of autonomy. And having less autonomy means they cannot make the same decisions that we could make. So they're beholden a lot of times to their parents or other adults in their environment, recognizing that they're in trouble and helping them with this. So either seeking help or doing something even individually within their families. And this particular issue with a lack of autonomy influences the presentation of impairment or symptom presentation. The thing that bothers me most, beyond the fact that we have far too many children in Canada who have mental health problems, is that they're not receiving services. So most youth in Canada don't receive services, only 20%. And the ones that do tend to have severely impairing mental health problems. So they receive treatment at a higher rate, and this is because they infringe upon the rights of others. So kids with ADHD and behavioral problems are often disruptive to their peers and to their teachers, and in their families, they cause a lot of problems. And again, like, this is not me suggesting that there's something wrong with these kids in terms of who they are as people. They just have behavioral issues. But this calls attention, and it means that they receive services. So what that means is that there are thousands and thousands of kids in Canada who aren't receiving services, and they tend to have internalizing problems. And internalizing problems are actually more prevalent than externalizing issues. So we have thousands and thousands of children and youth who are suffering in silence, who have anxiety disorders and depression and the like. There's also recent studies coming out showing that recent immigrants to Canada are less likely to access mental health care. So there's stigma that we need to reduce and address. Okay, so that's basically what mental health looks like, the landscape of mental health in Canada, and it's pretty problematic. So my next section I want to talk about is, how do we reduce this burden, and how does this relate to peer relationships? So if we want to reduce this burden, we have to improve children's peer relationships. In fact, I would suggest that we can prevent a lot of the mental health problems that occur. And the research is very clear, and I need to be very pointed in my comment here. I'm a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair. I think about science all the time. I do not make comments about causation unless it exists. There is enough evidence to point to the fact that there's a causal relation between mental health problems and poor peer relationships. So when I talk about poor peer relations, I'm talking about poor peer treatment, which would include bullying, victimization, and that occurs it's a systematic abuse of power where there's a power differentiation, being rejected by your peers, not being liked, and being isolated, neglected by your peers. Now, the concurrent correlates are extensive, and they're very well documented. So children who are treated poorly, so bullied or rejected or shunned and the like, ostracized, have academic difficulties, school truancy and avoidance, increased absenteeism, somatic complaints, stress-related illnesses, physical health problems, low self-esteem, depression, social withdrawal and isolation, social anxiety, loneliness, suicide, and aggressive behavior. So as you see, it affects virtually all aspects of functioning. But these are correlates, so we don't know about the temporal precedence. We don't know which comes first. Is it poor mental health to poor peer relations to exacerbated poor mental health? Or is it that children are well to begin with and become unwell as a function of how they're treated by their peers? I want to point out this other thing. So we did this study and it's been since replicated, and it replicates a couple other studies from before. There aren't that many how people have looked at this, but using a longitudinal design, what we found was that kids who get bullied by their peers go on to be perpetrators of bullying. So this is a pretty sinister pathway, and it's something that we need to attend to as well. Now, what are the long-term outcomes? So we did a review, my colleague from the University of Saskatchewan, Patty McDougall, and I combed the literature and looked at all of the existing studies that looked at the long-term outcomes of peer victimization in childhood and adolescence and how it affects adult functioning. So here, to be clear, these are studies that look at exposure to exposure to bullying in childhood and looking at over time and how it affects people even after they've been left those toxic environments and those toxic peer relationships. And the list is almost identical to the concurrent associations. So they tend to have more academic difficulties, job-related difficulties. Again, you see somatic complaints, stress-related illnesses, physical health problems. They have more interpersonal relationship difficulties, so across different contexts, workplace relationships, intimate romantic relationship difficulties, and the rest of the list is very similar, and they also tend to have a lot of substance abuse issues. So basically what the research is showing is that poorly treated youth either get mad or they get sad. So they either turn it against themselves or they externalize the pain that they're feeling from this poor treatment. And there's enough studies that highlight that this problematic interaction with peers extends well into adulthood long after the abuse has stopped. So I'm going to just highlight two really important studies. So in this study, they looked at adult health and across 5 decades of life. So kids were assessed in childhood and they looked at how they were functioning, in their 40s. And what they found was that victims of frequent bullying had higher rates of depression, anxiety disorders, and suicidality compared to non-victims. But what's really important about this study is that they found that the effects are similar to those who were in foster care or those who had multiple childhood adversities. So this is problematic. In another study that came out fairly recently in 2015, they compared 2 cohorts. So these are 2 population-based cohorts. One's from the United Kingdom and one's for the United States. And so they're, they have separate, the cultural differences aren't that great, but they certainly exist. And what they looked at in this study was they looked at child maltreatment. So kids who were maltreated by their caregivers, children who were abused by their peers, so bullied peers, kids who were bullied. And they also had a group of individuals who were both treated poorly by their caregivers and by their peers. And they looked at adult outcomes. So in terms of mental health, what they found was that obviously all of those toxic environments are not good for mental health in adulthood. But what was particularly surprising was that being bullied had a larger effect on mental health wellness in adulthood than being bullied and maltreated or just maltreated. And again, this replicates across 2 cohort studies. So back to the temporal sequence, what is it? Is it poor peer treatment leads to poor mental health? Or is it the case that kids aren't well to begin with, they get treated poorly, and then this leads to even worse mental health? The evidence supports this pathway more than the other symptoms-driven pathway, but there's evidence for both. So there is a causal link between being treated poorly by your peers and having poor mental health. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. There are copious amounts of studies showing that peer victimization is linked to internalizing problems in ensuing years. And this is an effect that even is found when controlling for prior symptoms. A meta-analysis asked, do victims of school bullies tend to become depressed later in life? And the answer is yes. And this was true up to 36 years later. So they're no longer being bullied by their peers, but the effects are lasting, long-lasting on depression. There's also links to externalizing problems. And again, this is true even when we control for externalizing issues to begin with. We just published this study, I think it was about 3 weeks ago. So we looked at the trajectories of bullying perpetration and how it relates to their interpersonal relationships in adulthood. So we followed, again, children from the time they were 10 up into adulthood. And what we found was that we could identify individuals in grade 5 who were bullying their peers, and they were more likely to engage in sexual harassment, homophobic taunting, and intimate partner violence in adulthood. So this is a huge problem. There's enormous continuity here. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we also have symptoms-driven pathways. So there are some children who are vulnerable, they have mental health difficulties, and the peer group picks on them and it makes their lives even worse in terms of mental health functioning. So we conducted one of the first studies to show this symptoms-driven pathway. And it's kind of daunting to be one of the first to show something because you wonder if there's something unique to your data set that doesn't replicate across other data sets. But it has since been replicated, and it's been replicated actually quite a bit. And I think that we might end up with like both pathways being equally represented. So in this study, we found that individuals who had internalizing problems in grade 5 were more likely to be bullied in grade 6. This led to even more problems in terms of depression and anxiety in grade 7, which led to even more bullying in grade 8. Recently, my postdoc, Amanda Craigsman, and myself looked at this across all of high school. So we actually, from elementary school to high school, and we found the same thing. We found consistent cross-lag pathways that indicated that children were depressed, then bullied, and then became more depressed. So this was true from grade 5 to grade 6, all the way from grade 11 to grade 12. We also published a paper with my other postdoc, Dr. Lee, in JAMA Psychiatry, showing the same pathways, symptoms-driven pathways, when we look at disordered eating, depression, and peer victimization. The kicker, and I know I keep mentioning a sad story, but we even see these links in preschoolers. So again, with Dr. Krigsman, we looked at peer victimization, aggression, and depressive symptoms in preschoolers. So these are 3-year-olds. We used a multi-informant approach. We had direct observations, parent reports, teacher reports, and what we found was that there was an association with kids being treated poorly at 3 and being more sad and having more withdrawn symptoms also at 3. So why this pattern of impairment? Because clearly something's happening here. So I just highlighted that we have significant mental health problems in Canada. There is a causal association between being treated poorly and having mental health problems, and also the reverse pattern. And I think this links back to our need to belong. The need to belong, in fact, is a fundamental human motivator. So now I'm going to digress a little bit into history, and I'm going to give us a longish story about correlational studies that point to social deprivation and how harmful it is to children. And then I'm going to present some experimental studies done with other primates that show that this is in fact true. So we know that social ties are not just a luxury. They're actually essential for optimal development. And history is replete with examples of social deprivation causing harm to children. If you isolate people from others, from caregivers, from peers, it doesn't bode well in terms of their physical and mental health. The United Nations Convention Against Torture states that torture is an act by which severe pain, suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person. And what's really interesting is that they characterize what we mean by torture. Included in torture is extended solitary confinement and shunning. So think about kids who are excluded from the peer group. They have no friends. They have nobody to hang out with at school. They spend their day in isolation, and what effects that would have on them. In the late 19th to early 20th century, about 100% of infants who were admitted to foundling homes, to orphanages, died before their first birthday. And this caused a lot of concern, obviously. If everybody who can't take care of their children, and they're sending them to an orphanage with the hopes that they're going to have a good life, they're going to live and do well, then this is a problem. One of the issues they thought was this had to do with sustenance. So there were just too many babies to one wet nurse. So they weren't getting enough of their nutritional needs met. But the same thing was also being shown to happen in hospitals, where the nutritional needs of children were being met, but they were also isolated from their parents. And one of the reasons they were isolated from their parents was because medical professionals were worried about germs, and perhaps that infant mortality was related to, this biological process. So what they did was they isolated babies into these little chambers. So they prohibited parents from seeing their children. They directed the nurses, who obviously would be all women, to not interact with the children or interact as little as possible. And the doctors, primarily male doctors, would also not pay much attention to them. So their nutritional needs were met, and they were not exposed to any environmental toxins. And what happened was the babies were dying. They were dying at very high rates. And a doctor, Dr. Baldwin, thought, well, maybe the way we're treating the babies is the problem. Maybe they need to have more affection. And so he developed this experimental study where he compared one hospital where it was status quo, don't disrupt the infants, to another hospital where they started to allow the parents into the hospital to interact with their babies who were sick. And you can see the two graphs, and you can see that the infant mortality rate was far better when children were interacting with parents. This was something that was also shown to be true by child psychiatrist Renee Spitz, who documented in a film of Mexican foundling homes the deprivation that took place when children were not exposed to cuddling and love and affection. He noted that the kids in these foundling homes resembled concentration camp victims, and that their behavior was consistent with what was seen with children who are low functioning on the spectrum of autism. But the scientific community went nuts. They thought there's no way that this is what's happening. There is a biased sample, it's a small sample size, and after all, this is a correlation, so it cannot imply that there's causation. Again, history is replete with examples that children need affection in order to thrive. The Romanian orphanages showed very similar outcomes. In the 1980s, 65,000 children were placed in orphanages. 85% were placed before their first year of life. The caregiver to child ratio was horrible. So can you imagine taking care of 10 infants as one adult, or 20 children if they were over the age of 3? The children in these orphanages spent over 20 hours a day in a crib unattended. and the cognitive, social, and physical deficits are well documented. So one of the interesting things about these children is a lot of them were adopted into British Columbia. And so there have been a lot of studies that have looked at how they're faring over time. And the latest study looking at their mental health in adulthood shows that they have 40% mental health problems. So 40% of them are diagnosed with a mental disorder. And if you compare that to 15% of the general population, you see that they're not faring well. In 2018, we saw history repeat itself. The past is prologue. We see this over and over again with the USA child separation policy. So they separated immigrant children from their mothers to deter asylum seekers. Almost 2,000 immigrant children were separated from their parents. 70,000 migrant children are currently held by the US government. And these strict policies mean that we have way too many children in detention, separated from their loved ones. The impact of this inhumane policy is a horror show for everybody to see in the world. Isolating adults, seniors, is also problematic. We know that loneliness is robustly linked to morbidity and mortality, and that loneliness doubles the odds of mortality. Loneliness is such a problem that in the UK, they have a ministry of loneliness to deal with this issue. There are so many examples of these, and I understand that this is just anecdotal. I'm going to show you some experimental designs in a second, but these stories always catch my breath. In this one, an Ohio couple that was married for 70 years died within 15 hours of being apart. So again, the need to belong is a fundamental human motivator. But so far, I've just focused on infant caregiver attachment and highlighting how that's problematic. The thing is that we can't do an experimental design on humans, obviously. And Harry Harlow set the precedent for the kind of work that I do. And it's been very influential on my work. He was interested in love, and he was particularly interested in maternal deprivation, which is what we just described. But he was also interested in the examination of peer deprivation. He published a series of seminal papers that are still referenced to this day. And one of his classic studies is he separated a rhesus monkey from its caregiver, well, several rhesus monkeys from their caregiver, and he gave them the option of having he recorded how much time they spent on the terry cloth mother versus the wire mesh mother who provided them with sustenance. And this was in counter to Freud, because Freud said that the reason that babies love their mamas is because we provide them with nutrition. And that is the attachment. The attachment is about food. What he found was that they would go to the wire mesh mother, of course, to meet their sustenance needs, but they spent the bulk of their time on the terry cloth mother. He also noted something that Renee Spitz noted in the Mexican foundling homes, that first they protested when they were separated from their mother, then there was despair, and then there was detachment. He moved these studies further to see what matters most for child development of rhesus monkeys. He recognized that attachment is a continuous process, that the infant monkeys attach to caregivers, but also to their siblings, and importantly to their peers, and that this set a stage for other relationships. It became your prototype. So having poor attachment to your caregiver can set you up for problems with your peers, and having poor peer relationships can set you up for having problems with your romantic partner in the future, that sort of thing. So he devised a study where he had 3 conditions: monkeys that were raised with peers only, those that were raised with their mother only, and those that were raised with mothers and peers. And the findings were that mothers and peers are best. But interestingly, and I think quite surprisingly, and a lot of people don't know this, that the peer group fared better than the mother-only condition. So the juvenile monkeys in Harlow's study thrived when they were raised with family and with peers, but they did not do well when they were isolated from their mother or from their peers, and especially not when they're isolated from their peers. And the reason being is that you learn things from the peer group. So juvenile monkeys learn things from their peer group, but children do, human children do as well. They learn how to enter a group. They learn how to manage conflict. They learn how to self-regulate. They learn all of these really important things, all these important competencies that are needed to do well in the world. So just to highlight this, again, that the relationships are essential for optimal development. And I'm not suggesting that parent-child attachments are not important. They certainly are. But peer relationships were also critical for optimal development. And this is the story of my research. So I know this to be true for the 20 years that I've done research in this area. Judith Rich Harris wrote a theory about this. Unfortunately, she just passed away a couple weeks ago. And she talked about, she proposed a group socialization theory of development. She postulated that while parents are often the primary source of social and emotional support for young children, as children age, the peer group becomes more important. Now, the parenting researchers went nuts. They did not like this at all. They didn't like the implication that peers would matter more than parents. But I have an adolescent daughter upstairs, and I can tell you that I know she loves me. I know she loves her father and her sister, but she would rather be with her peers. And that is developmentally appropriate. And I understand that to be true. So you could see then if it's developmentally appropriate, if she doesn't fall within a peer group or is treated poorly by her peer group, that it could be problematic. Again, we are hardwired to belong. We have a fundamental biologically based human drive to form emotional bonds and attachments with others. And this extends beyond our caregiver attachments. We know from the resiliency literature that the most consistent asset of resilient children is having a strong bond with competent adults. But there's also new research coming out, and it's coming out consistently, showing that good peer relationships are also a consistent asset of resilient children. And just recall that UK-USA comparison in the study that looked at child maltreatment to bullying victimization and adult outcomes. So I went to Zambia about 10 years ago to give a lecture, and I had the privilege of going to a bunch of different orphanages. So in Zambia, they have the highest AIDS rates in the world and the highest HIV infection rates. And so there are a lot of orphanages, and there are a lot of children in these orphanages who lost both parents to this horrible infection. And this orphanage in particular was doing well on all indicators. The children were doing well considering the precarious early beginnings of their lives. And I spoke at length with the director of the program and the individuals who were working in the orphanage. And I kept asking, what's your secret formula? Like, what are you doing? These kids seem so different from a lot of the other places that I visited. What is going on? And they said that they had focused on peer relationships. So what they have done is they made sure that the children in the orphanage became a family, that everybody was included, that everybody felt affirmed. Unconditional positive regard was their mandate. Peers matter for health and well-being. I delineated that at the beginning of the talk, and I'm just going to highlight again that the Harry Harlow study, that mothers, caregivers are not going to be enough, that you need to have peers in order to flourish. So now I'm going to just focus a little bit so that we're not completely sad about my talk, about social emotional learning and how I think we can remedy this issue. So if you want to improve the mental health of children and youth, you first need to focus on their fundamental need to belong and never ignore that that's something that they need. So even though they may be functioning well in their family, we need to also be asking about their peer relationships. And that was one of the take-home messages in that Globe and Mail op-ed that we wrote, because I was very frustrated with hearing physician groups advocate for children to return to school, suggesting that they needed this for a good mental health to be with peers, knowing that they don't often ask about that in their clinical practice. So we need to focus on their fundamental need to belong, and in particular, their peer relationships, especially when they're older. Obviously, if they're 2 years old, we're going to be focusing on their immediate environment with their caregivers. We also need to prioritize social emotional learning and development. Now, we know this from the work of Erikson, Piaget, Vygotsky. All of the early developmentalists pointed out that the primary developmental tasks of childhood are skill development, physical, cognitive, and social emotional. The other thing that's really important in terms of the tasks of childhood is integration. How do you get along with others? How do you have good peer relations? The research is really clear that competencies in these areas of development are socially mediated. So learning happens in relationships. Relationships matter. So if you're a teacher on this Zoom meeting right now and you're thinking, okay, how do I apply this to my classroom? Well, you need to understand that kids are going to school to be with other kids. And then we're going to sprinkle on some math on top of that. We're doing a big study that's launching on Monday, trying to see what's happening with the pandemic in terms of children's peer relations. So you check back with me in a couple of weeks, and I'll let you know how children are faring during this, this very unprecedented and disturbing time. In terms of social and emotional development, what we mean is the interrelated cognitive, affective, behavioral competencies that help children and youth. And keep in mind, this list is hierarchical: cooperate with others, follow directions, pay attention, and self-regulate. But at the top of the list is cooperate with others. Social emotional competence is associated with future positive health, education, and well-being. And if you target social and emotional competencies, you see better social and academic adjustment, you see reduced levels of problematic behavior, and you see reduced emotional distress and better mental health. The nice thing about this is that these core competencies can be taught and with great effect. So when you look at the meta-analyses that are coming out on social emotional learning interventions, they're fantastic. And we usually don't see such good effect sizes for things. So when I look at the bullying prevention intervention studies, bullying prevention and intervention studies, the effect sizes aren't that great. When you look at the social emotional learning effect sizes, they're excellent. So when we use this in schools and we target social emotional competencies, hence social emotional learning, kids fare better. Social emotional learning also is linked to bullying, which is, one of the core focuses of this talk. So bullying has a strong link to social emotional competencies, and applying a school-wide social emotional learning framework has been shown to reduce peer victimization and perpetration. Now, there's some really interesting work coming out of the lab of Dewey Cornell, and he's looking at Baumride's parenting styles, where they focus on structure and support. So we know from the child development literature, the parenting literature, and this has been replicated across every country in the world with hundreds and hundreds of studies, that the best outcomes for child development are related to authoritative parenting. So these are democratic parents. They have high structure, so high expectations, but they also have high support. So let's figure this out together is a good way of describing it. Authoritarian style doesn't bode well for child development. You do it because I said so. Being negligent, do whatever you want, I don't care. the outcomes are not very good, and being permissive, being your child's best friend, doesn't have very good outcomes either. So what we are focusing on is structure and support. So he's published a few really good studies, population-based studies, showing that when schools focus on this type of parenting and apply it to their schools, bullying and teasing go down. So the first blue line are the child reports, so student reports, and the orange line are teacher reports, which are independent. And the striking thing is that they're almost identical, and you usually don't see that. So schools that were characterized as having high structure and high support tended to have children faring the best. Okay, so let's just recap everything. In summary, we have a mental health crisis, I think, in Canada. 1 in 5 children is far too many. We know that we can reduce this burden by improving children's mental health. And the reason we know this is because there's a causal relationship between children's mental health and poor peer relationships. We know that the need to belong is central to child development. So children have a fundamental need to belong. It's a fundamental human motivator. We're hardwired to belong. Not only do we need to belong in terms of our primary caregiver relationships, but we also need to belong with our peers in our life. We need to have good peer relationships. And the research on social emotional learning, social emotional interventions points in the right direction. And it seems to be the most efficacious way of handling this. So I'm here to say that I think we could actually improve children's mental health by improving their peer relationships. And I'm just going to remind you of the children that I met who had the worst beginning of their life and were doing well because they also had good peer relations. And now, I guess we take questions. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. You've given us so much to think about, Tracy. We do have some questions already popping up in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to moderate those questions. And I'll remind everyone to please use the Q&A function to send any questions Dr. Vaillancourt's way.
Great, yeah, and as Susan said, great talk, Tracy. Really appreciate you doing that for us today. Of course, I know you'd rather be in person to see the people who are asking you the questions, but I'll try my best. I know, I'll try my best to moderate this effectively. So we have some, I'm going to go to chat first. So this is from Suzanne Tuff, who's an Owerko Center member. Hi, Tracy, thanks for the great talk. What advice do you have for families, parents who are trying to support children through COVID when typical peer interactions are challenged? How do we support relationships? And do we need to be concerned about online bullying? So a lot in that question, but maybe you could have a crack at that.
So I know Suzanne well.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of hers, so I just need to first give her a shout out. Hello. I don't know. And I usually know. So I'm not too sure. And I've had a lot of discussion with leading psychiatrists, psychologists, educators around Canada, partly because of the work I'm doing with the Royal Society of Canada. I know that there is a certain percentage of children who do not fare well in school. And so we've noticed, clinicians have noticed that a segment of the population who's never done well is doing better. So kids who have social anxiety disorder is one example. Children who have been ruthlessly bullied are doing better. And they're doing better in a way because of the attributions that they're making. So, it's pretty lonely when you know everybody else is having fun, but when you're at home not having fun and you know everybody else is also not having fun, it makes it a little less painful. So I think there's going to be a silver lining for some, which then highlights the need for us to rethink education. And I actually think that this is going to be a forced innovation for us, that we haven't been able to shake this tree in large part because the way we teach children is so entrenched and it's so traditional. And I think this is going to get us to rethink it. So there's going to be, I think, a silver lining. Now, in terms of bullying, we're asking that specific question. We're asking about cyberbullying. We're asking about their online learning environments. So I hear anecdotally of this, of course. I get people contacting me all the time saying, you know, my daughter was bullied in her learning hub, this and that. My son was made fun of because of the way our house looks on the Zoom you know, interactions, that sort of thing. So I do think that there's going to be a little bit of an uptake in cyberbullying, but I'm not 100% sure what to do. I just know that this is really problematic for child development. And I understand that we're balancing a public health initiative of keeping kids safe and their families safe and the people in their community safe by also meeting their needs. So I would love for kids to be in schools. I think that they need to be with their peers. But I also need to highlight that for about 35% of Canadian kids, schools are not good places for them. They get bullied. They get bullied occasionally, and for 10%, they get bullied every single day. So we need to rethink that. So Suzanne, I'm really sorry that I wasn't answering that, but I'm gonna, you know, I have to be honest about what I know and don't know.
Yeah. Well, a great answer nonetheless. I'm going to jump to Keith Yates. Keith is online right now, and Keith, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Mark.
Okay.
Hi, Tracy. Thanks for a really great talk. I'm the head of the Department of Psychology here, and Susan's ostensible boss. So I sent her back channel text about how great this talk was, because I have had an interest in peer relationships for many years, particularly in kids with neurologic disorders, and have done research on peer rejection and victimization in kids with traumatic brain injury. But my question, after all that, is how do we try to affect this at a policy level? We're really talking about trying to do school-wide, district-wide, national-wide interventions around social emotional learning. And what can we do as scientists to promote that?
That's exactly what I'm suggesting, that we need to have this rolled out nationally. And you know how education is dealt with at the provincial and territorial level. So, and we need to have this be a national platform. So in the op-ed that we wrote, that's what we called. We called Trudeau to the mat on this. And we said that we needed, you know, a child commissioner. We need to prioritize children. And I would love to see this actually be rolled out nationally. There is enough evidence to support that we can use these social emotional learning programs, and it should be part of every school. And like, I understand the challenges, because again, that education is not a federal mandate, it's a provincial one. But certainly if people like yourself and myself and everybody's on the call keeps her, like, well, maybe not harassing is the right word, but, you know, keeps challenging and challenging our government to put funding towards this, then we'll be in a better place. So I'm going to challenge everybody on this Zoom meeting or lecture to do that, to start writing to their MPPs and their MPs and say that this has to change. We can't tolerate our ranking in the world. We can't say we love children and have that ranking. We can't say we love children and have this many children suffer. And I know you probably have the same experience, but I've been scrambling trying to get kids seen by clinicians. I'm calling every favor I can to have kids who are very suicidal, not doing well, be seen by clinicians. And they're not able to see children who are in incredible distress. This is a problem. So the nice thing about school-based interventions, though, is that we have more control than what we do for family-based interventions, right? So I think we'll have more success. I'm not saying we ignore families. I'm just thinking we're going to have more success if we go to schools with this.
Thank you, Tracy.
Great question. We have a lot, so I'm going to keep moving. I'm going to keep moving along here. So another question from chat: what influence do you think social media has on mental health and belonging to a peer group?
I think it has an enormous impact, and there's evidence to support that children who spend more time online are more depressed and anxious. They make a lot of social comparisons. I think that they don't have the capacity to appreciate that it's impression management, that it really is. You know, you go on to, I'm not on Facebook for a good reason, because I don't think I could withstand it. You know, I don't want to see a post picture that makes people looking like they're having fun and that it's a common event, and then feel bad about myself because of it. But kids need it. In a sense, it's their lifeline. So it's a circular problem, because on the one hand, they're vulnerable if they're not on social media, and on the other hand, they're vulnerable because they are on social media. So there's strong links to that. There's also strong links to social media use and sleep deprivation, and sleep deprivation in turn is related to mental health issues. I think we need to get a grip on this, and we don't have a good grip on it. And I think it's going to come to, we have social media literacy that happens in schools. I think that we need to be really concrete with children and have them understand, the psychology behind it, the impression management stuff behind it.
Not just for children, adults too. We all fall prey to that, don't we?
Yeah, and exactly. Which is, again, I said I'm not on Facebook.
Yeah,
I refuse to be on Facebook.
Yeah, I'm going to move to the Q&A because we've got quite a bit of activity there. I'm going to try and do this as best I can. So the question I'm going to look at, because this question is talking about bullying and what can parents do. So my question is, what can we as a parent of one child only do to make that child feel as though they belong to a group? If they're not accepted by their peers in school, if they get bullied, what can we do? As parents, we give them unconditional love, of course, but outside of our home is beyond our control. What would you say to that?
Yeah, and it's such a common question because bullying is so prevalent, right? So one of the things I think we need to do is, and this is going to sound a little controversial, but we need to stop listening to our children on this, because they're going to tell the parent to not talk to the teachers or the principal. And the evidence supports that once we intervene at the level of the school, bullying almost all bullying stops immediately. So kids think and teens think that we're going to screw it up, and they think that it's going to get worse and there's going to be some retaliation. Now, I'm not saying that it's a perfect situation, because it sometimes does happen, but on average and on the greater average, when you talk to your son or daughter's teacher and principal, it stops. So that's one thing. So they may have a good idea about the social norms of their school, but on this one, they tend to be wrong. The next thing is that you can create other peer opportunities through sports and extracurricular clubs and the like, and create a peer group that way. I think that parents of other kids need to step up too. So I get so frustrated when parents are not inclusive. So my big thing is, you invite all or you invite none, like, especially when they're younger. Like, obviously now my daughter's in high school, I can't have everybody from her school come. But when she was younger, when we invited kids over for a birthday party, everybody in the class was invited. So I think we can do as adults a bit of social engineering. And I am very frustrated by a lot of adults who don't do it. And they think that that there's a preference, and I understand that there's a preference. Some kids like certain kids more than others, but we have the power to model this, to be like, role models, to be morally engaged, and to have kids feel good about themselves. And so that's the way I stand on this.
Okay, thank you. Looking back at the chat, there's a couple comments here. People are asking, can you share your slides, or can we get a copy of this presentation? I can answer one half of that, is that we are recording this presentation, and we'll put that up on the Owerko Center website. And perhaps, Tracy, you and I can talk offline, and if you're willing to share slides, we can do that too.
And I purposely put my email address at the bottom, because I'm happy to send my slide deck to people. So you could just send me an email, and I will definitely send that to you. Great.
Okay, jumping back to Q&A. Thanks for a wonderfully clear and fascinating talk. As an eating disorders researcher, I'm particularly interested in your study with Dr. Lee, I think it was, that included a measure of disordered eating. Would you elaborate on what that study found?
So I'll just go back to it real quickly so that I can show the slide specifically. And basically what we looked at were cross-lag associations between bullying, depression, and disordered eating. And what we found was that disordered eating always preceded depression. So the temporal pattern used to be, you would think that kids became depressed and then had an eating disorder. There's some literature to suggest that. That's not what we showed. But we also showed that kids who had a eating disorder were more likely to get bullied in the following year. So you can see that cross-lag effect from grade 8 to grade 9, and we see it again from grade 10 to grade 11. And one of the things that I think is going on with that, and I'd be interested to hear the feedback on my comment here, is that there's a lot of, so if you think about eating disorders from an intra-sexual competition framework, and I'm not saying that they're all born from that, but certainly there is a component to competition and social comparisons. A lot of, and especially with girls who lose weight, that engenders jealousy from other girls and they get picked on. So this seems to be, I think, part of the mechanism of what's going on here. And it's what we also suggest in our paper.
Okay, thanks for that. Great question here on chat. Almost all schools these days have anti-bullying programs. Why is bullying still so prevalent?
I think it's because our anti-bullying, well, first of all, the anti-bullying programs typically don't work. And I know that sounds pretty harsh, but if you look at the meta-analyses and the systematic reviews, they're just not working. They're reducing bullying by a little bit. And I think there are a few problems. One, we're focusing on the wrong type of kids who bully. So we did studies in the 90s to 2000s. It was part of my dissertation where I was really interested in high status bullies. And this has since been replicated around the world with really big studies as well. So the Finnish group, the Dutch have replicated it. It's been replicated in the United States. The kids who do the bulk of the bullying in high schools and in elementary schools are the ones who wield the most power, because bullying is a systematic abuse of power. But we tend to have focused historically on the stereotypical bullying. So when you think about Nelson from The Simpsons, and those kids represent about 10% of kids who bully others. And they tend to have dysfunction of the prefrontal cortex, that, you know, like self-regulatory issues. A lot of times they'll have problems with attention and as I mentioned, self-regulation. They tend to run amok of everybody. So they kind of pick on everybody and they don't wield a lot of power. But the most influential kids in the high school and in middle school and also a little bit in the elementary school are the ones who are doing the bulk of the bullying, 4 times greater than this stereotypic bully. Our programs have not been good at dealing with these kids. So I know of one program only that deals with these high status bullies. It's called the Kiva program. It's from Finland. And the kicker with that program, and I know I keep saying something's a kicker, is that the ones that were most impervious to the effects of the intervention were the highest of the highest status bullies, because they don't want to give up their power holding position. They achieve and maintain hegemony through aggressive means. So that's why I didn't come up with an anti-bullying program recommendation. I came up with a social emotional learning recommendation, because that's where the evidence is pointing towards. So if we could get kids to be more socially competent, more morally engaged, that sort of thing, better at self-regulating, then I think we're going to see improvements in bullying.
Okay, great. Gonna go back to the chat function here. Let's see. Could you please mention how often mental health problems in children are transgenerational?
So there is, I mean, we know this from, the research suggests that there's a heritability rate that's pretty high, and then there's a shared environment rate that's pretty high. So if you look at anxiety disorders, for example, if you look at meta-analyses, about 62% of the variance is linked to heritability, and then the rest is linked to shared environment and non-shared environmental influences. So we do know that mental health issues are, run in families in a sense. Now, it doesn't mean that it's inevitable. Heritability doesn't mean that it's a fait accompli, that this is what's going to happen. I think that we can do a lot better on our children's mental health by focusing, again, like I said, on peer relations. But also, I think that, a comprehensive approach is always going to be best. where we're working with children who are nested in families, who are nested within schools and the like.
Okay, great. On topic too about peer relationships. Peer relationships are clearly very important. What are your thoughts regarding how to integrate adolescents with ADHD and poor social skills who have been rejected by peers? The case for social skills training currently is not very strong.
I agree. The case is not strong. And one of the issues is if we look at the social skills training programs from the 80s, 90s, and moving forward, a lot of them are designed to change the individual, right? So there's something inherently wrong with the individual. We're going to infuse them with social skills, and then we're going to then put them back out into the peer group. And they fail. And they fail because the peer group still holds a negative evaluation of this individual. So even though they're using all the right skills, they can't catch a break because they have a bad reputation in a sense. So I think that, and this is what the social emotional learning programs are, they're universal. So they're not, so you would have targeted and universal. You would have all kids learning to have better social skills. And if they all learn to have better social skills, they're going to be more tolerant of individual differences. And then we're also going to have some targeted programs. And it's very difficult. One of the difficulties also with kids with ADHD is that they overestimate their social relationships, the positivity of their social relationships. So they don't pick up on the early nuances that they're not being accepted. And then it goes all the way over to the other side where now they're actively rejected and they're being victimized. So there needs to be a little bit of skill building on that end too, where they recognize earlier in this developmental pathway. Now, I know I'm contradicting myself a little bit because in a way I said at the beginning, they don't work because we're infusing kids with skills that the peer group won't be open to. But I'm saying that that needs to happen in addition to the other peers being tolerant of differences and also having better social skills. One thing it's pretty clear to me as somebody who's done this for many years is that, we're good at teaching reading, writing, and arithmetics, but we're terrible at teaching relationships. And they're not very good at them. They're clumsy. If you ever have children, and Mark, I know we heard your little one trying to get into the room when we were doing our testing. I'm sure you have a very competent young boy, I think, at home, but
I have many.
Their social skills are not great, right? They're learning. So we need to help them out in that area. Right.
No, that's a good point. And I think there's another, I'm trying to answer as many as I can here. So I'm going to keep going, but there's a comment on chat, which I think kind of is dovetailing here. Thanks for a great presentation. As a parent, I was horrified that Canada is ranking so low in those global statistics you talked about. Things need to change. My son is blessed with a principal that believes strongly in making peer relations a priority at school. My son has benefited from the support, and I strongly believe that this makes things different. So shifting gears a bit, what do you think of the new building that is currently being built in Calgary, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Center? I'm not sure you're probably familiar with that, right?
I'm a little bit familiar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Big picture. Great investment in this center. It's been deemed a priority by many folks. So there's it's great energy behind building this bricks and mortar center that research and clinical practices can happen. Knowing that, what should we demand from a place like this? What should we demand from a center? What can we expect to change because of such an investment?
I think that you have to have a partnership with schools. And if you don't partner with schools, then I think that you're not going to have the effect that you want. So certainly we need to deal with children and families, like for sure. But you need to you have to have a partnership with schools. The other thing I would think is that, and a lot of people don't, if you have a child with mental health issues, this is a problem. We don't have enough clinicians. We don't have enough trained individuals. So I would imagine that this institute is going to be attached to the University of Calgary, correct?
Correct, yeah.
I think that our clinical psych programs across the country and our counseling psych programs need to open up space. they're too small. You know, when I think about University of Ottawa, we admit 10 students. I don't know how many you're admitting. That's never going to meet the needs of the population. We need more clinicians. So, you know, those are like two little things that you need to be thinking about. And I'm not too sure, like, I know that our programs are intensive in terms of faculty, supervision and the like, but I certainly think we can also improve our numbers, and that would help with the situation. Because I'll tell you, we have individuals who have a bachelor's degree, an undergraduate degree in psychology, who are working with kids who should be dealing with somebody who is a registered child psychologist or psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And they can't get in to see them because there's just not enough capacity.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to stay out of that minefield. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm going to let the psychologist in the audience think about that. I'm going to move on to another question from the Q&A. Great talk and so much good work cited here. I hear many people, parents and teachers both, citing Neufeld and Mate, I think it's Gaber Mate, right?
Yeah.
Hold on to your kids book and the danger of peers and friends to kids' health and mental health. Interested in your thoughts on how our thinking and evidence has changed since this was first published, which is in 2004.
So one of the things about this is this, like, so we sit in different camps, obviously, right? Like I sit in the peer relations camp, he sits in the parent camp. And I'm not saying parents aren't important. Like they're absolutely important. I mean, when things aren't going well with my children's peer relations, they're coming to me, right? Like definitely that these should be all inextricably linked. But the thing about peers that's problematic is when the peers are deviant, then that's a problem. So if you had a choice between your child having very few friends, but they're good kids, versus a lot of friends and they're engaging in a lot of problematic behavior, I would pick the very few friends, because there's been a lot of research showing that deviancy training is robust, and that kids, so studies have shown that, for example, risk-taking appraisal is very good in adolescents until you put them with peers. And if you put them with peers that are higher on conduct problems, their IQ diminishes to 0. So that's kind of like what's going on there. So it's not to say that all peers are good. And, you know, when kids want to belong, so they'll belong to any group that they can. They'd rather belong to the wrong group than not belong at all. And that can be problematic to their trajectory.
Okay.
Is that politically correct enough?
I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it to the audience to figure that one out.
Yeah.
I think so.
Between the lines on that one.
Yeah. Speaking from personal experience, my parents may have done the same thing, but we'll leave that alone. Getting back to kind of the idea of from online relationships, this question from the chat again. Many youth connect with their peer network online through video games. My son does the same. Can you comment on the need for face-to-face interactions versus virtual interactions and the protective effect of peer relations on mental health? And I know you've spoken to this, and I guess the essence of the question is there a difference, or how much emphasis should we place on one type of peer relation versus the other, right? An online, like a virtual relationship versus a personal interaction? Is there a difference?
Yeah, definitely there's a difference. And when you think about it, like there's no way our brain today is based on a sliver of an evolutionary process. There's just no way. So our brain is designed to belong, right? We have a fundamental need to belong, and it keeps us alive. Historically, it's kept us alive. You needed to belong to not get eaten up by the saber-toothed tiger. So now we have this very, very new environment, and it doesn't even represent like a grain of sand on the biggest beach in Australia in terms of our evolutionary adaptations.
Right.
And so it is a blink in time, and it doesn't match our brain, because our brain is set to pick up on the nuances, the little sighs, the prosody, the little eye roll, the moving over, the looking at your watch, all of these things are being missed. And I wonder what the implications are going to be for health and wellness. There's already evidence to support, again, that I said that kids who are more online, so that would include texting, gaming, and that sort of thing, tend to have poorer mental health. But there's always a silver lining to everything, because there's some kids who had no friends in the past and have a very strong online community and feel like they belong. So I don't want to say that everything's all bad or all good, because it always depends. And I tend to subscribe to a differential susceptibility framework, which means that in one context it can be problematic, whereas the same thing in another context can be good. So I know of kids who have been severely maltreated by their peers, who have had no social interactions for years and found an online community and have flourished because of it.
Yeah.
But I do think that we need to put down the phones and start looking at each other. We're missing a lot.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I'm going to try and dance around to a few different areas here. So I want to get back to Q&A, and I know this is a little outside the scope of children and mental health, but there's a couple of questions that are talking about seniors. And so if one were to think about, can we generalize that the same type of results that we see perhaps in children to some of those same seniors we see like isolated in care homes, for example? And then as a kind of anecdotal or as a supplementary question to that, do you know of any efforts, not just in Alberta, but maybe Canada-wide, to connect youth, whether that be at universities or younger, with seniors who may be suffering from loneliness and things like that? So those questions.
So definitely seniors need to have peer relationships. And it's really interesting. Again, remember I told parents to not listen to their kids on this one thing when they say, don't contact the principal. And I say, no, contact the principal. A lot of times seniors are resistant, right? They want to stay in their home. They want to live independently, and they're living independently in isolation. And that's problematic. And they tend to do extremely well when they get into a long-term care facility where there's a lot of activities with other seniors, right? So, so they definitely need to belong. I don't know of any programs. I'm just starting to think about the peer relationships of seniors. And part of this is like born from, not to get too personal, but my mother-in-law died of COVID. And I'm so hurt by the fact that she died alone because of COVID, right? So her daughters and my husband, nobody was with her. And I just wonder, and she also had dementia. And I wonder if part of her susceptibility to the COVID was related to her not understanding why nobody was coming to see her anymore. And that breaks my heart.
Sure.
So I'm really interested in loneliness in children, and I'm really starting to think about this in earnest in seniors. Mm-hmm. And whoever asked that question, contact me. I'd love to talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And many similarities between the two, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to jump back to chat. Many SEL traits are being debated as being non-trainable, such as resilience, empathy, and self-regulation. Do you think these are traits that we can train, or represent personality traits, or represent permanent personality traits?
It's a good question, because I always tell my students that temperament is as stable as IQ. So it's really hard to change, somebody's core temperament. So when I was preparing for this talk, and obviously I'm quite familiar with the literature because this is what I do for a living, I'm a scientist, I came across several studies that are actually looking at specific components of social emotional learning and targeting them and seeing which ones work better. And the person who asked that question is correct, that some seem to work better than others. Some seem to be more resistant to intervention. There is a lot of evidence that self-regulation can be taught, though. The ability to cool your jets. I mean, that's most behavioral modification programs are about self-regulation. So, but I agree that it's I gave a fairly general comment about social emotional learning, but we need to be a bit more specific. And if I had more time, I would have been a bit more targeted in my comments.
Okay, great. I'm going to jump to Susan right now. Susan, are you still with us? There you go.
I am, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tracy, for answering all these questions as well. One of the things that I've heard a couple of times during the pandemic that has surprised me has been some results on the mental health of teenagers. One came out of a UK study, and one was out of a study in the US. I think it's Jean Twenge that did it, showing that at the beginning of the pandemic, some teenagers were actually experiencing better mental health. And I'm wondering if you've heard much about these studies and what you think of them.
So this is the thing that I said that we've talked about in our think tank, in our group. And, you know, I'm also trained as a clinical psychologist. And so I'm not surprised. Like, I know of kids who are doing better and have done better because of the pandemic. And I said that for a lot of kids, school isn't ideal, the way we have it set up. Kids with social anxiety disorder is one example, kids who are bullied and the like. One of the fundamental problems with all of these studies, though, and I need people to, when they consume this research, to be mindful of this, is that nobody's controlling for prior health. So we actually did a study with our large cohort, a COVID study, and we're just starting to look at it. So when people say that substance use increased or depression increased or decreased, you can't say that in a cross-sectional design. You can only talk about change with a longitudinal design. And most of these studies are not longitudinal in nature. So it's kind of a little bit of fudging of the data. So just be mindful of that. I don't think we can say it's one way or the other until more people engage with longitudinal designs. And really what they needed to do was to have an existing data set and jump in on the COVID right away. And that's what we were able to do with our study. Unfortunately, I have nothing to report to you right now because we're just in the middle of writing it up. So come back. I guess I'm trying
Wonderful.
to get an invitation for a talk or something.
Well, we would love to have you back. Maybe Marco, let me ask one more question, actually.
Of course, yeah, of course.
I was really compelled by the data you presented showing how school climate can make such a big difference. And so when they have that more authoritative climate, outcomes are so much better. I know there's a number of people from Workland School of Education and from the Faculty of Social Work and Psychology, et cetera, who are on this call. How do schools create this kind of climate? What tips do you have?
So I'll just give you one example, but there's definitely some research that shows the nuts and bolts of this. So I engaged a school board. I gave this talk about this structure and support to school board, and they said, let's try it out. So I said, you know, they were really good on discipline. They had a lot of support a lot of structure, but the support could have been a lot better. And one of the things in Ontario is that the high school teachers do not need to go into the hallways to greet students during transitions between classes. And I said, let's have volunteer schools who are going to ask their teachers if they can come out and greet students, and the schools that are going to just do what they normally do in this particular school board, and we'll see what becomes of it in terms of, being sent to the principal's office. So that kind of disciplinary infractions. So the kids who were being greeted, the health of the school improved exponentially to the point where the other schools didn't want to continue on with what we were trying to do. So they jumped out of the placebo condition in a sense and went to the greeting condition. And that's been shown to be empirically true, right? Just these little things, these little acts of civility and caring matter. And I often talk about, when I give a presentation on this, I show a picture of my daughter, Molly, who's an elite soccer player. She plays soccer in the United States for a university, a D1 school. And she had a black eye. And it was like enormous, right? Because she got hit as being a keeper. And the whole year she kept telling me her religion teacher, this was in grade 7, didn't like her. And I was like, trying to do the CBT with your kid, reframing it. I'm sure she likes you. What's not to like? You're such a great kid, all of that. But she was convinced this woman did not like her. When she went to school with the black eye, all the teachers asked her about it. And they should. It's a due diligence. What if I'm the one who whacked her, right? Like, they should be asking. And the one teacher that never asked her about her eye was the religion teacher who she thought didn't like her. And then I was on her side thinking, yeah, she's probably right. So can you imagine, like, you're a kid, you're coming into school, you have this big event, this big injury, and you're not even asked about that? So I think we should be doing these little acts of showing that we care. They go a long way. And if you want to improve behavior and have less teacher burnout, that's a way to do it. But, you know, I mean, I understand it's tough. You know, being a teacher is a tough job. But, you know, when you choose discipline over support, you don't have good outcomes. You have to have both, right?
Thank you. Mark, I know we're getting to the end of our time. Do we have any outstanding questions?
We've got some, and I apologize to those that we don't get to. I just think we are running out of time very quickly. So, and I must admit, I don't know, because, you know, I can't click my fingers and get everybody to vanish at 3:30, but I'm worried that it's going to hit 3:30 and everybody's going to vanish. So I'm wondering if we should perhaps just stop there. But I would say, and maybe with Tracy's permission too, if people do feel as though they have some other questions, perhaps they'd like answered, they could connect with you via your email that's on the screen right now.
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear from them.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I don't have anything other than say thank you for attending to all those questions. There's many, and again, sorry we didn't get to everybody, but Susan, I'll leave it to you for the final word.
I just want to thank you again. You've given us so much to think about, and we would love to have you back anytime. And again, I just want to thank Stan and Marge Owerko for their general support of this lecture series and the Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye.